Okay, so I think we're just about on time to start today's session. Welcome everyone who is joining for today's reactor session. Today we are doing a workshop which is Start Your Datacentre Transformation Journey with Azure Migrate. So you're very welcome and we really hope you enjoy it. Today's session is going to be delivered by Sarah Lean. Sarah is a cloud advocate at Microsoft and has over 14 years experience within the IT industry. So we're very lucky to have Sarah delivering today's session. Just to give you all a bit of background about the reactors in case you don't know. So reactors are local community hubs for startup and developer groups. So reactors build a diverse community by providing training, workshops, industry speakers, meetups and other community events. So all related to emerging technology trends. Reactors are physical event spaces. So usually we host events in person at our reactors, but given current circumstances, we're now hosting our sessions online, so like we're doing today. So getting back to today's session, it will be 1 hour long. The session is being recorded and I will share the link with you once it's up on our YouTube channel. That will go on the Reactor Meetup London page within about 48 hours. You're welcome to ask any questions throughout. There is a Q&A window for you to ask those questions. They'll be published and we'll make sure they're all answered by the end of today. So without further ado, I will hand over to our speaker today. So Sarah, I'll just stop sharing my screen so that you can start sharing.
Awesome, thank you, Emma. So hopefully you can see my screen. As Emma said, my presentation today is about starting your data center transformation journey with Azure Migrate. And just a little bit of background about who I am. My name is Sarah Lean and I'm a cloud advocate at Microsoft. As Emma said, I've been in the IT industry for about 14 or 15 years now, and I'm definitely in that camp of being an IT pro or infrastructure engineer. That's where my passion lies. That's still where my passion lies, even though that I'm now looking at cloud deployments. I'm also a STEM ambassador, as I'm hugely encouraged by seeing young people come behind us and helping more females as well come into the IT industry. Now, as you can probably tell from my accent, I'm from Scotland and I always like to include a little bit of Scotland into my presentations. Now on screen you'll see a map and each pin represents where my team currently sit. So you can see we represent about 7 different time zones. So it makes meeting each other really challenging when we're trying to do team meetings. But the blue pin in the middle is Scotland, and Scotland is the home of Highland cows, or Highland coos as we say, and I just love showing them off every time I get to present. So just a little bit about me there. So as I said, today's session is about migrations, and I've been talking to customers about migrating for various different reasons. There's lots of different drivers that people are looking to migrate away from on-prem environments for, things like capacity issues. They've ran out of physical space within their data center and need to add more, but physically can't. So they're looking to leverage the cloud to help them do that. Or they're looking to replace hardware and software that has run out of date. Often on-prem, we traditionally ran software and hardware for 3 or 5 years, and then when it started to get into life, you start to sign that new contract and jig everything again. And when people are reaching those limits, those contract end dates, they're starting to think about potentially looking to move to the cloud. However, regardless of what your migration driver is, I always talk about 4 key stages that every organisation, regardless of size, driver or industry that they're in, has to go through and they have to think about. And those 4 stages are discovery and assessment, migrate, optimize and secure and manage. So what I want to do today is take you through those 4 stages and just talk to you about each of them and show you where Azure Migrate can actually help you on that journey as well. So the first stage is that discovery and assessment. Now, lots of people say, do we do a discovery first, or do we look at doing our strategy first? Do we start to think about how we actually migrate our workloads into Azure? And for me, the discovery phase has to come first. You have to understand what's in your environment in order to do that strategy, because you could end up saying, I want to move everything as a PaaS solution and have serverless and not look after virtual machines. And then you find out halfway through your project that one of your services, one of your applications can't run serverless and needs to run on that operating system model as well. So you really have to do that deep dive discovery of understanding what's in your organisation and where the future of your organisation is going, so you can actually strategize. Now, it shouldn't just all be about technology, your discovery phase. It should be about people as well. You should be looking to speak to stakeholders within your business, looking to speak to the different business project managers, people outside of your IT department, and even interview your IT staff. Because again, our technology is only a part of the concept. We need to understand how people interact with these solutions. We also need to try and find out if anyone's planning on replacing these solutions during our migration phase. Unfortunately, I've had a customer who has kept the discovery, kept the involvement all internally into the IT department, and then they went out to their stakeholder and their change management board to get it approved, and someone said, oh, that application you're talking about there, or that workload, is actually going to be decommissioned. We're no longer needing it and we're replacing it with something new. So the plan had to be scrapped and redone again. So often there's decisions happening outside of the IT department that can influence what's happening for your migration as well. So definitely include everybody in your organisation somehow in order to gather all of that information. It's also a great place or a great point in your migration plan to think about staff training. So think about where your staff are in terms of knowledge and skill set. Have some people been learning the cloud in their spare time? Have they got qualifications? Are there some people that need to go on training? Where are your staff on that kind of journey as well? Because it's key for them to be able to support this workload going forward and keep that going. Because often I see a lot of people bringing in migration partners, migration specialists. They run the migration project, and then they leave, and the staff that have been in the IT department for years are left trying to look after a solution that they didn't implement, and they have no knowledge of the platform that it's hosted on now. So definitely look at investing in understanding where your staff are on that spectrum of understanding the cloud as well. Now, I often get asked about what you should be discovering during the discovery phase, and what I've done is actually put together a baseline for your discovery checklist. So it tells you basic things like you should be discovering your server names, the operating system, where those servers are physically located, because again, you're probably going to stumble across something hidden in the corner that you didn't know about. And yeah, you need to make sure you've got a note of that if your documentation doesn't already note it. Other things like the audits that you have to adhere to, which standards do you need to adhere to, and which ones should you be aware of, moving to the cloud that might be changing. All sorts of different information are in that checklist, so please do have a look at it. It's open source because it's hosted on GitHub, so if you want to add to it, please do. If you want to remove some things or comment on it, again, please do. It's all on GitHub, so I appreciate any information and any additions to that as well. Now, within the discovery phase, there is something you should be thinking about, and that's cost. You should be costing up your existing environment so that you can look and compare it against what's going to happen within the cloud if you were to move your workloads. Now, it's not often easy to do that because we tend to sign those big contracts every 3 or 5 years where we buy a bunch of hardware, we buy a bunch of software, and then we tend to leave it. And we just say that's the cost of running our data center, but there are hidden costs, things that you maybe have forgotten about or don't appreciate, things like electricity, things that security, the physical security, the time and effort that your staff have to put into overtime and stuff like that. So all of that adds up into what is your price of your current data center costs. So you need to do some digging if you haven't got that information and try and get it so that you can accurately assess what it's going to look like if you move those workloads into the cloud. Now, we have some things and tools that can help you with. We've got the Azure pricing calculator, which can help you price up those Azure resources. Our total cost of ownership calculator, again, helps you with understanding what's your current on-prem environment costs. We've made some assumptions based on data from other customers, so if you haven't got your own data, you can use the data within the total cost of ownership calculator. And lastly, there's the cloud cost optimization tool that gives you some information around optimizing your workloads once you get them into the cloud. Now I want to show you where Azure Migrate fits into this piece of the puzzle. And Azure Migrate has been around for a long time. We actually announced it in September 2017 and it went generally available in February 2018. And as you can see from the timeline, it's kind of grown and added a lot of functionality over that period of time. And well, a lot of that functionality has come back from feedback from customers and feedback from people saying that they want this. This is how they want to assess their environment. This is how they want to migrate their environment. What we've seen Azure Migrate expand into is not just one tool, but actually a hub for your data center migration. So we have the key migration scenarios. So we can look at assessing your virtual machines, your web apps, your databases, or even your virtual desktop environments as well. And it's not just that discovery tool, we can actually do the discovery, the assessment and the migration. So it's kind of that one-stop shop tool that can help you from start to end of that process for you as well. And it's not just our tooling we have in it. We're not just precious about pushing out our tooling. We actually have partnered with a lot of our third-party or ISV tooling, and we have them within Azure Migrate as well. So you can mix and match if you prefer a third-party tool. You can actually use that. And what that helps you with is keeping everything in one place. Now, I'm a big fan of having as few windows open on my machine as possible, and having to have as few URLs or addresses for things to be open and remember them as well. So having all these third-party tools feed into the Azure portal through Azure Migrate is actually really good, because it's that one-stop shop, that one central repository for us to do our migration from, and again saving us open up multiple windows all over the place. Now what I want to do is actually show you a bit about Azure Migrate. So let's dive into a little demo and I'll show you some of the discovery features. So here we are in the Azure portal, and what we want to do is have a look at assessing some of these servers we've got within our environment. Now, I've already assessed the servers, so I've already had the Azure Migrate Discovery Appliance installed in my environment, and it's gathered a bunch of data. So let's evaluate the data that it's collected. Now we can see that it's assessed, or it's discovered 30,000 different servers within my environment. So if I dive into this, I can see quite quickly I've gathered some information from that environment. The names of the servers, IP addresses, I've got cores, I've got memory, I've got storage, I've got operating system, and that's just the base level. That's the basic information that you would expect these kind of tools to discover. But what else we have available to us is looking at things like the applications that have been discovered on those servers, the functions, the features that are on those servers. A whole host of information has been actually gathered on this tooling. So if we have a look at the application inventory, we can see what it's gathered. We can see different software has been installed on it. This server has some SharePoint software installed on it, also has some SQL Server software installed on it. So if we didn't know what this server did, we could maybe be able to decide what it was based on the types of software or applications that it had installed on it. So potentially this could be a SharePoint server with having some information. We've also got the roles and features. So again, if you didn't know what it was, you could maybe determine what it was based on the roles and features that we have available on that server. Now what we want to have a look at is actually creating an assessment. So gathering all that data that is collected and bringing it together to show us the price of what it would look like if we were to host those workloads in Azure. And also if these workloads are actually ready to be hosted in Azure, because there's some things that might catch you out if you're not aware of them. So we're going to look at our payroll application. So it's a bunch of servers. So it's 9 different servers in this payroll application. And we have information here. We've got the Azure readiness, the monthly cost, and also we've got some storage cost based around that. So if we drill into each of these, because it's an interactive report, we can start to determine what things look like, and we can start to find out a wee bit more about the servers as well. So we can see here that we've got 2 servers that aren't or maybe ready for moving to Azure. And what we want to understand is why they're marked as ready with conditions. So if we look into the report, we've got, again, a bunch of data around those servers. We've got the server name, we've got the size that Azure would recommend hosting that virtual machine in as, and suggested tools for migrating it as well. Now, if we scroll down, we can see that some of them, like we saw, are marked conditionally ready for Azure. Now, we can look into them and determine what's happening with those servers and figure out what remediation we have to carry out for them as well. Often what you'll find is it's marked conditionally ready because potentially the workload is maybe a Linux one and we haven't been able to determine the actual operating system. So what we say is go and have a read of our documentation and compare the version number of your operating system with what's supported in Azure. And that's often what that conditional with ready actually means. So now that you've discovered your data and you have a good picture of what's happening within your environment, and you've got the go ahead to kind of look into the next stage of the project, and that's migration. Now, what you'll hear around migration is often these 5 or 7 R's that we talk about. So we often talk about rehost, refactor, re-architect, rebuild and replace. And like I said, I've heard some people do 7 R's, but what I want to say is don't get caught up in what these 5 or 7 R's actually mean or go down that route. I've had tons of customers that have went down the rehosting route. So they've basically done that lift and shift from their on-prem environment up into the cloud, and that's for a number of reasons. Because of budgetary reasons, they've got timelines, they just have to do it. One classic customer was that their data center was getting a train track right through the middle of it, and unfortunately they didn't have the time to refactor or really do a deep dive into what was happening in their environment. So they literally just lifted and shifted everything out of that data center into Azure, so that they would still be functioning and still have their data center running when the train came through, basically. So there's no right or wrong answer at this stage, and that's the message that I really want to get across. You'll often hear your peers, if you go to user groups or you speak to your previous colleagues, etc. They might be doing something where they're rehosting things, they're replacing things, and they're looking at serverless, and you're still looking at VMs and think your company is backward. And I definitely don't think that's the case. As I said, there are definitely scenarios where lifting and shifting or rehosting your virtual machines is absolutely the way forward for your organisation. What you need to remember at the migrate stage is that things don't all happen at once. So you're not going to be all migrating your workloads all in like one weekend or one evening. It's probably going to be a long-term strategy and might take a lot of time depending on what you're doing and how much your workloads are actually moving. What I would say is definitely don't move or definitely don't tackle your most important workload first. When you start to do this migration project, it will be a learning curve. So please don't pick your payroll application or the mission critical application that helps dispatch all your products from your website, and whatever it may be. You want to pick something that isn't important to your organisation but kind of challenge you as well. So maybe have a couple of tiers with that application. Pick something that has a SQL server and maybe a web front end, and then you can learn how you migrate those and you can move them into the cloud. And I say don't pick your most important one, because if something goes wrong while you're on this journey, you definitely don't want your CEO or your boss's boss on the phone shouting at you while you're trying to figure out what's went wrong. You want to pick something and learn from an application or a workload that isn't mission critical, so that if something does go wrong during that first migration, no one really notices and you're not under stress to try and fix it. Be clear about what's happening. Make sure you are communicating with your IT department. Also be clear about communicating externally with your business. Make sure everybody's on board. Your migration project really isn't just about technology, it's about people. People are adopting new ways of working and new things are happening. So make sure you're doing that good communication so that everything can go smoothly and people don't end up saying if something goes wrong that it's the cloud's fault, and they get a bad image of it, and future projects are hampered by that as well. Please also don't forget about looking at things like your monitoring, your management, your disaster recovery, your backup. All those kind of things need to be considered. So you probably all have those on-prem at the moment for your workloads. And when you migrate them into the cloud, you need to also think about them. Now, I have some customers that don't necessarily implement backup and disaster recovery right away when they migrate their applications or their workloads, and I have other customers who implement them as part of their migration project. Regardless of when you implement it, you're going to have to implement it. Although there are some processes and kind of procedures in place from an Azure point of view to make sure that your workloads aren't going down and they're protected, you also have to have some due diligence as well, and there's a shared responsibility around making sure that everything is viable. Now, where Azure Migrate can actually help you in that scenario and migrating your workloads is that we have the ability to migrate away from your VMware, your Hyper-V, your physical servers, even servers living on another cloud provider. So if you have some virtual machines living on AWS or GCP, we can move those for you as well. We have the ability to test before migration. So if you're worried about what's going to happen when you migrate a workload into the cloud, we have the ability to test it. We can test it, and we can work through the plans, and we can work through what happens to that virtual machine when it does migrate into Azure. And you don't impact your production environment by using those test plans. We also have agentless. So at the moment, a lot of the migration happens with an agent, but at preview at the moment, or sorry, generally available at the moment, is support for actually moving your VMware, migrate your VMware virtual machines without having to install an agent. So there's different ways of doing this, and there's different tools available to you, but hopefully you can cover off a lot of the scenarios that you want to do with Azure Migrate. Now, a question that I often get asked about is, should I be using Azure Site Recovery or should I be using Azure Migrate to actually migrate my virtual machines? Now, a few years ago, we didn't have Azure Migrate, as you saw in that timeline area earlier. So we advise people to use Azure Site Recovery. Now that we have Azure Migrate and we have dedicated migration tools, we say that you should be using, our best practice is to use Azure Migrate. You could still use Azure Site Recovery, but Azure Site Recovery is our dedicated disaster recovery tool. So it's not designed to actually do that migration path for you, whereas Azure Migrate is, and that's where a lot of our research and development is going into it, and a lot of the feature requests are surfacing themselves up in. So what I want to do is actually show you what happens when you use Azure Migrate to move your virtual machines into Azure. So here we are in the Azure portal, and we're going to tell Azure Migrate that we want to migrate our virtual machines that are hosted on-prem in Hyper-V into Azure. So we're picking the East US region to move all our servers into. And what this does is sets up the tools, sets up the project within Azure Migrate for us, and it will give us a download that we have to install on-prem. So once it's created that tool, as you can see here, it's given us the option to download a bit of software. Now we have to install that bit of software onto a server on our on-prem environment. It could be a dedicated server, it could be another server, you could repurpose any server. Regardless, this bit of tool helps you to lift and shift those virtual machines from on-prem up into Azure. Now, when we're setting it up, we're building in an encryption tool. So the traffic is encrypted from on-prem up into Azure, and that's basically what those settings are setting up. They're making sure that all your environment is going from your on-prem environment up into your space within Azure. So now that that has set up, what we want to start to do is actually start to replicate our virtual machines. There's a small button you have to click in the Azure portal just to finish off that connection, and again that's just securing the connection from on-prem up into Azure, and again making sure that everything is going into your environment and not somewhere else. So the tool has discovered 4 servers on-prem, and those are 4 servers that we're going to look at actually migrating. So we can see it's discovered actually the migration appliance as well, so we're not going to be migrating that. So ultimately we're only going to be replicating and migrating 3 of our servers on-prem. So what we do is they tell the tool that it's virtual machines hosted on Hyper-V, and we can tell the tool here whether we actually want to migrate with the information that we've found within the assessment tool. So one of the things that the assessment tool does is actually it can look at the performance of your virtual machine. Now, we're probably all guilty of oversizing our virtual machines on-prem or physical machines if we can. And what the assessment tool does is looks at a period of time of your virtual machines and then figures out what size you actually should be. So rather than move your virtual machines on-prem up into Azure oversized, too large, and you have to pay for that cost, what we can actually do is use the migration tool details and resize our virtual machines. So you can either apply those settings or you don't have to apply them, but that's basically what that question is asking. So we pick the 3 servers that we want to migrate. So we've got a SQL server, an IIS server, and a Linux server as well, that all form part of our payroll application or this non-critical application. Now what we're telling the tool here is where we actually want to migrate our virtual machines to at the end of the day. So that's things like a resource group, what storage account we want to use for the data, what virtual network, and what subnet as well. Now you have to set up this all before you actually get to the tool. So you should be thinking about, you should have already had your landing zone or your area set up. So you should have all of this detail set up before you start to do the migration. Now the second screen here we've got is around compute, and that's setting things like the size of that virtual machine, what operating system that virtual machine runs, what disk we're moving, and we also have the option to look at the disks themselves. So again, if you have a virtual machine that maybe has 5 or 6 disks attached to it, you potentially might not want to move all of those. So you have that option to ditch some of the disks and not migrate them with you as well. Now, the replication process will either take a few minutes or could take several days, depending on your connection, the size of data that you're moving, etc. So we've obviously sped this up for the purposes of the demo, but it basically took about 24 hours for those 3 virtual machines to migrate or replicate from on-prem up into the cloud. Now that we can see that these virtual machines are actually protected, what we want to do is think about testing them. So we want to do a test migration. So if we go into each virtual machine, we get the test migration button, and we are migrating those replicated virtual machines into our environment. And basically what this does is actually spins up a virtual machine that we can interact with. So it will actually spin up a live virtual machine that we can interact with. So we can RDP into, we can check ports are open, we can check ports are closed, we can see what services have come up, if there's any additional software we need to install or uninstall. We basically get that test environment, and it's completely separate from the production environment, so it doesn't impact the fact that you've already got that virtual machine still running on-prem. We'll see when we go through to it that it's even given a different name, so we don't have to the same, that there's not a clash of names on that network or on our environment. So here we are, we've got these 3 virtual machines, and as I said, they're appended with -test. So we can log into these, they're just virtual machines on Azure, and you can interact with them and test what's going to happen so that you're secure and knowing what happens when you're doing that migration. If you're doing it at 3 AM in a field with lots of caffeine, you've already got the plan, you've already been through it, etc. So what we would do once we've tested these migration tools and we are happy that the virtual machines run and we know the processes, we want to tidy all of that up, because the last thing that we want to do is leave these resources running and have to pay for them, because you do have to pay for the resources when you migrate them across, even in the test option. So we go through each of the virtual machines and we tell it to tidy it up. So it'll delete the resources that it spun up for us. Once the test migration is all complete and we're happy to actually go through the migrate, we've got our change request in, we've got our change window open, we can start to migrate these virtual machines now and actually make them live in Azure. Now you have the option to shut down your on-prem ones. So if you want to minimise data loss by having the ones on-prem shut down so that there's not any data being written to them while you're migrating, you can do. Or you don't have to. It will entirely depend on your workload and what you're actually migrating. Now, again, the migration should actually be quite quick because the data is already replicated into Azure. So we're basically just creating that virtual machine. Once we've done that, you can actually see these virtual machines are called just the name that you would expect them, the name that they were on-prem. They're there for us. We can start to connect to them. They should be where everybody will be pointing to now. So that's the migration process from taking the virtual machines you've discovered on-prem and actually making them live in Azure. So now that you've got your virtual machines and your workloads running in Azure, what we start to want to look at is our business as usual activities. We start to want to look at how we manage the cloud, how we optimize it as well. We spend slightly different than what we're used to in Azure than we were on-prem. That CapEx and OpEx kind of model has all changed. And we need to start thinking about understanding our cost trends and keeping a track of it. Now, I'm not advocating that you keep track of your costs every day or every month. Unfortunately, I've seen some customers get caught up in trying to look at their costs and trying to budget every day, and they get into a bit of a pickle. What I would say is take an overview of your environment every 3 months, every quarter, maybe every 6 months, depending on your situation and staffing levels, really. And what that'll do is it'll give you a good trend of what's happening within your environment. So you'll be able to see when workloads spike, what sizes your virtual machines should be. You know, are your virtual machines running at 10%? So you could really start to look at downsizing them massively, or do your virtual machines actually run at 100% the whole time? So do you need to actually look at upsizing them, which again will cost more money, but in the long term it'll give you much more performance benefits. So if you take that overview of a long view, then you get a better picture of how to optimize it as well. Now, the other stage is really secure and manage. And like I said, there's a shared responsibility with the cloud. And that's really around making sure that you understand what's your responsibility versus your cloud providers. Now, on-prem, you are probably used to doing everything from looking after the physical security, maybe even making sure there is stock of toilet paper within your data center. But most of those tasks aren't yours anymore. Microsoft and Azure will take care of your physical assets, the physical security, the hardware, you know, replacing disks, making sure that hardware isn't too old, etc. But your responsibility really needs to lie on making sure your data is secure, making sure you've got the best practices for passwords, for multi-factor authentication, your ports are shut down, all of that things. That's where your knowledge and experience should be focused on now. Now, your secure and manage is probably something you should be thinking across the whole time of your migration project, but it's one of those stages that's actually going to stick and be a business as usual activities. You're going to have to know what your responsibilities are, keep an eye on them in case they change, any new procedures, any new best practices. You also need to make sure your documentation is constantly updated. I'm a big advocate of saying update your documentation throughout the entire migration project, but that's not obviously physical. That's obviously not always easy because you're trying to do the migration, and trying to find time to write that documentation can be quite hard. So if you haven't done that already, make sure your documentation's up, because the last thing you want to do is have, say, an outage of a server and someone refers to the documentation, runs into the data center, sees the server is switched off and powers it back on, and suddenly you've got data being written to your old on-prem server and data being pushed as well to your Azure server. So make sure documentation is up to date. Make sure you have a staffing plan, staff training plan for going forward. The way that Azure works is that it's not static. It definitely changes every day. It's constantly changing. I'm constantly having to learn and adapt my skills and learn new things and touch new technology. So make sure you're training your staff on what's happening. Make sure they're up to date. Make sure they're confident with it. Gone are the days that we only send people on training courses and certification courses every 3 or 5 years when a new piece of operating system comes out or a new bit of software comes out. That's definitely not the way forward, and you need to be proactive about how your staff are learning and keeping up to date with the cloud. Now, a lot of the things that I've touched on today can actually be found in the Microsoft Cloud Adoption Framework for Azure. And what that is a bunch of documentation that Microsoft people, partners and customers have all put together around migration. So if you're looking to do a migration, please do have a look at the Cloud Adoption Framework, because it can give you some pointers on how to start, how to talk budget with your finance controller, how to set up roles and responsibilities, how to look at training your staff and where to start with that training. And also, if you're already on that migration journey and you're needing a bit of help, the Azure Cloud Adoption Framework can actually help you with that as well. It's broken up into different stages, so it can look a bit daunting when you first look at the documentation, but it's split up into different sections, and you can jump into each section depending on where you are on your journey or what information you're actually looking for. Now, we also have the Azure Migration Centre, which has, again, great guidance and tools, and also information about partners that you can find. So a lot of my customers do opt to go with migration specialists. So they bring in someone who concentrates solely on delivering migration projects, and they bring them in and they deliver the migration project. And that way, the staff aren't having to learn how to do a migration project because, let's face it, we're hopefully not doing another migration project for at least 3-5 years or even longer. So bringing in somebody who dedicates themselves to doing migrations can actually help speed up that migration. Can also take a lot of the stress away because they have a lot of experience and don't necessarily have to learn as they go. So the Migration Centre is definitely a great place to have a look at. And that's kind of me for today. So thank you for listening. I've put a load of the resources that I talked about, further documentation, further demos as well around Azure Migrate on the link on screen. So please do check it out. And my contact details are on screen as well if you have any questions. But I think hopefully we have time for questions, and I will get to the questions if you've asked any during the session now as well. So let me have a wee look at the questions here. So yes, a question I forgot to cover off during the session, actually, Azure Migrate is a free tool. It's free for discovery. We do leverage some of log analytics, so there is a small charge in terms of storing some of that data that you might collect around your dependencies and your servers. But if you look at Azure Analytics or Log Analytics, sorry, it's very cheap to run. It's probably at the cost of a coffee cup if you run it quite cheaply. You can delete the data after several days and not have to keep it if you don't need to. So Azure Migrate is definitely a free tool. When you come to the migrations, we do offer a free period of migrating your servers. So once you start to replicate them, I think you have 90 days of free. If you have to have them replicating for longer than that, then there is a small charge associated with that. But basically, Azure Migrate is very free and very accessible. And I definitely say if you're even just thinking about a migration and you want to discover what's in your environment so you can have that conversation with your boss, Azure Migrate is totally accessible there. You're not going to run up a big bill, if any at all. So we've got another question here around how does Azure Migrate scan an on-premise environment? Does it require installation of agents? So yes and no. So there's different ways. If you're looking at trying to evaluate your Hyper-V virtual machines, we install a server that attaches into the Hyper-V environment and pull some information around that. If you want to do the dependency mapping, so if you want to look at how all your servers interconnect, what ports they connect to together, so if you want to see if server 1 uses port 80 to connect to server 2, you do have to install an agent to get that dependency mapping. Same is true for VMware. We pull a lot of that with agents as well. And again, actually, it's the same for physical servers. So it depends on if you're just trying to discover the names and information around your servers, or if you're looking to do that deep dive. The deep dive really is worth it. I definitely would say looking at installing an agent, although it can be cumbersome if you have lots of servers, it definitely gives you lots of information to base your strategy depending on what's happening with your servers. So yeah, there's 2 different methods around all of that. Hopefully that makes sense. So we have another question here. I have web servers with application and database running on Rackspace private cloud. Can I migrate this? Absolutely, yes. We can do the discovery and the migration slightly different if you don't have access to that hypervisor level of your servers. What you can actually do is look at using our physical assessment and migration tool. So you look at just the VM itself. If you have access to the Hyper-V or VMware level, you can use the tooling from Azure Migrate around that and actually move the virtual machines from the hypervisor level. I've actually just got a blog out last week around moving your virtual machines from AWS. So that's very similar. You don't have access to the hypervisor level. So we assume that all the virtual machines within AWS are actually physical machines, and we assess them and migrate them that way as well. So you could do that if you have things within Rackspace and you don't have the hypervisor level. So we've got another question here around a great deal of options in Azure Migrate sound like I can make a real-time decision on them. So does Azure Migrate have a provider for HashiCorp Terraform? I don't think there's a Terraform module. I think the team are still working on getting some of the APIs available so that we can leverage them more programmatically. But at the moment, I don't think there's a Terraform module available for Azure Migrate, unfortunately. So we've got a question here around once a workload has been migrated, where does it go for authentication and authorization? That will depend on how you're setting it up. If you're moving a virtual machine and it traditionally got its authentication and authorization from Active Directory, a domain controller on-prem, as long as they can still see that domain controller, as long as you've put that connection either to on-prem or you've put a domain controller in Azure, it will still get its authentication there. There's no difference. You're just moving that virtual machine to another place. So as long as the connection back to your authentication method, whether that be Active Directory or something else, that's how it would work. Hopefully that answers your question. So I've got a question around a step before optimization ought to be app testing, surely. So does Azure Migrate help with that, such as app performance and response times? Azure Migrate won't help you with that. What you would have to use is some of the Azure monitoring tooling and some of the application insights tooling that would help you in that. Absolutely, testing is definitely something you would do, and probably I would do within the migrate stage. So you'd migrate it, do some testing, make sure it's okay, and if the testing came back okay, then you would sign off and actually say that that was migrated. But yeah, you would have to look at something like application insights or Azure Monitor, or even a third-party tooling to kind of bench test it and test it as well. So we've got a question here around thoughts on a cutover strategy and how to deal with in-flight projects, manage scope creep in case of long-term roadmap. I suppose that's always the risk with any project. There's going to be scope creep. I guess you just have to understand whether that scope creep is actually going to be worth it or not, and adding that into the project. But that's yeah, hopefully you'll have a strong project manager and boss and leadership team that will help keep that scope creep down for you as well. But yeah, that's definitely something that folks struggle with any type of project. Another question here is, are migrated operating systems one-to-one with the original, or are you upgrading a 2012 SQL to a 2019 SQL server? So you're actually just, if you're migrating the virtual machine, if you're lifting it and shifting it into Azure, you're not upgrading it. So if it was hosting, say, Windows Server 2012 and SQL Server 2012, that's what it would be migrated as in Azure. It would land in Azure as a 2012 box with SQL 2012. You could do an upgrade. Some customers do upgrades before they migrate. I've also got customers that do the upgrade after they migrate into Azure. It depends again on the workload, on whether the roadmap kind of says that it's okay to migrate from those operating systems. If you're doing 2012 SQL to 2019 SQL, I think there is a path to do that, and it's a supported path. So yeah, it's up to yourself how you migrate that, and look at those operating systems as well. I think that's all the questions that we've been asked during the session. If anybody's got any more questions, please do feel free to reach out to me. Still got some time left. Or my contact details, as I said before, you can reach out to me and ping me. I'm on Twitter. The resources as well that I posted earlier have got lots of great reading you can do as well. But yeah.
Thanks, Sarah. Just jumping back in here. Thanks so much for today's session. It was absolutely great, and also thanks to everyone for getting involved and asking some really great questions as well. As Sarah mentioned, we still have a couple of minutes left, so if you do have any more, feel free to post them in the Q&A now. Or if not, you can reach out to Sarah after the talk. I just wanted to post a very quick survey link. It is very quick, I promise you that. So we would really appreciate any feedback from today's session. We'd love to get your feedback on how you find these sessions, if you can recommend any improvements, and what you liked, what you didn't like, and it won't take very long. So I will just post that in the Q&A now. So there's a link, and then there's a event code that you need to put in at the beginning of the survey, which would be great. So I've just popped that in there now. Yeah, and thanks again for attending. Our next session, I believe, is next Tuesday as well, so you can find all of those details on our meetup. Yeah, and I think that's everything from our side. As I mentioned in the beginning, the session is being recorded, so it goes onto the Reactor YouTube channel, and that should take about 48 hours. So definitely by the end of the week, it should be on there. Great. Okay, I don't think there's any more questions coming through. Sarah, thanks so much again for delivering this session. Really appreciate it, and it was absolutely great. So thanks so much. And yeah, I hope everyone has a great day and enjoy the rest of your week.
All right, thanks everyone. Bye.
Bye.